All right, good morning. Well, it's been a week. So let me just address the elephant in the room. In case you saw on Facebook, our building was vandalized on, was it Friday morning when we saw it? Thursday? I don't remember. And somebody had spray painted the word Pharisee on it, on the front door and on the side of the building. And a lot of people are confused by that. They're like, we're anything but Pharisee. So let me just let everybody know where that comes from, okay? You have to, first of all, stop thinking rationally, all right? Some of you are like, you're trying to figure out, like, how are we Pharisees? It has nothing to do with reason. It has nothing to do with history. I think it was 2 days prior to that, our Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, in giving a speech, addressed the press and basically called the press Pharisees. And in doing that, he was equating the work of the War Department with the work of Jesus, and anyone who questioned the work of the War Department as Pharisees who opposed Jesus on legal grounds. And so if you want to understand why such a very specific phrase would be spray painted on a building like ours, you have to put it all into context, right? So it has nothing to do with whether we're Zionists, which was one comment on the Facebook post. Like, no. There were some other things. So everybody needs to understand, like, the behind the action was an understanding that at least me as the leader is very clearly positioned as an anti-white Christian nationalist. And I think as a whole our church recognizes that is not part of the peacemaking path of Jesus. So the rhetoric that comes out of the War Department says if you speak out against the war, if you speak out against the way in which decisions and policies are being produced, then you are speaking out against Jesus, which makes you a Pharisee. And so that's why whoever spray painted Pharisee put Pharisee on our building. So under their logic, okay. I am your definition of a Pharisee. I got no problems with that. So that's what happened, but we're grateful for Sai who was able to get that off. Some people have asked, like, how are you feeling? I'm feeling motivated. So as I like to start off, if you are a guest, if you're tuning in for the first time, online or here in the room, welcome to a church that cares deeply for people who feel spiritually disconnected, disenfranchised, or are deconstructing their faith. My name is Ryan. I'm the lead pastor here. My pronouns are he, him. I am a white, cisgendered, heterosexual man who has benefited from systems that have favored people like me. And as a follower of Jesus, I believe that naming those privileges and leveraging them for others is the start of a life committed to peacemaking and justice, or what Jesus called the kingdom of heaven. Philippians chapter 2 tells us that though Christ had every status, he let go of all of them and took the form of a servant. And that's the path that we're learning to walk here. So whoever you are, however you've come to here, to this space, to this moment, whether you are certain or skeptical, hopeful or hurting, you are welcome here. And I hope that you will join us as we walk in the peacemaking path of Jesus together. There you have it. All right. So we can move on. All right. Let me ask you a question. Get ready to raise your hand up, all right? Little audience participation. How many of you could think of a person in your life who is deeply cynical, maybe driven by fear, closed to possibilities of hope? Raise your hand up nice and high. You know that person, right? Okay. We know that like type, right? If we think of it as a trope, as like we know that reality. And that person, like that way of existing in the world, right, often comes with a belief that I'm just being wise, right? Like that cynicism, I'm just being wise, I'm careful, I'm mature, I'm protecting my peace, right? And it comes out, right, in this very cynical way. Like nobody can ever be trusted, no one can ever do anything right? And somewhere along the way, right, we think of that as discernment, right? But really what we've done is there's been enough experiences in our life or in that person's life that we stop practicing discernment and we start practicing emotional self-protection. Like, I don't want to be hurt again, right? And so we start to project that past hurt, that past pain, whatever it might be, not only just on that person, never giving them an opportunity to change, but also onto other relationships around us, right? We just bring certain assumptions. And sometimes in like church world, we'll even call it, oh, I'm guarding my heart. I'm guarding my heart. But actually, somewhere we crossed a line from wisdom in relationships and discernment and love into like fear. Fear starts to drive the ship. Past pain, past hurt, it has a tendency to do that. And fear can often sound like wisdom. Would you agree? Like fear can sound like wisdom. I'm just being careful. I've learned my lesson before. Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on you, right? These are things we say. People never really change. They're all the same. Right? You just got to lower your standard. People are always going to disappoint you. And sometimes there's wisdom in these statements. But sometimes our wounds masquerade as wisdom. And that's hard to discern. It's hard to discern when a wound, right, is actually masquerading as wisdom and holding us back from opportunity. And here's the thing, wounds that masquerade as wisdom, one, they make us suspicious. Suspicious, they turn us into cynics. But there's an other side to the coin, right? And I know some of you that are skeptical, some of you that are cynical, you're in the room, you're like, oh, but. And you're like, and I've got a big butt, Ryan. Here's the thing. There's the other side of this coin, and I will give this to you that if we have no wisdom and just love, what do we have? We have naivety. Sucker, right? Right? Love without wisdom makes us naive. But here's the thing about both of these extremes, right? Suspicion and naivety, both of them end up in the same place, and that is closed-hearted living. At the end of the day, if we are full of cynicism, we close our hearts off to hope. We close our hearts off to intimacy. We close our hearts off to the possibility of transformation. We close our hearts off to a future that's bright. And naivety will do the same thing to you. Because naivety will put you in a place where you get hurt and hurt and hurt and hurt and hurt. And we end up in a space of closed-hearted living. And the line between guarding our hearts in a healthy way and all of a sudden having closed-hearted living is razor thin. And we don't realize when life has pushed us over that line. But here's the thing, guarded hearts, right? There is a space and a need for a guarded heart. And guarded heart exercise what I would call resurrection discernment. Now, I've crossed over from general ideas around life into a very specific Christian language of resurrection, okay? So I just want you to catch that. And I'm trying to bring this frame now into what does it mean if I'm living my life centered on this peacemaking path of Jesus. I take this broad concept that we all live in. Doesn't matter what faith tradition you hold. But here's how we can think about this in our tradition, right? And that is guarded hearts will leverage what I would call resurrection discernment. And that is this, wisdom with love. Wisdom with love. And that's kind of what we want to explore today as we kind of wrap up this series about the promises that we make to ourselves, is what does it mean to have wisdom with love as a spiritual type of discernment, right? As a superpower discernment almost. And I want to look at a resurrection story in the scripture that we don't often equate with the resurrection. I want to look at a story about a guy named Saul and Ananias. How many have ever heard the story of Saul and Ananias? We're going to go Sunday school on you here today, all right? I wish I had a big old felt board. Do you know, one time at a church I pastored, we built like a 20-foot by 10-foot felt board, and we literally printed life-size felt, and we did adult Sunday school, and we talked about how messed up some of these stories are that we teach our kids. Maybe that's why they fired me. But no, I'm just kidding. They didn't. I didn't get fired. Some of you are like, that were on the search committee, you're like, wait, what, huh? No, I didn't, no. We just talked about him from an adult faith perspective. It was a lot of fun. Maybe we'll do it here. I'll recycle that one when I get tired of writing sermons. Be like, pull one out from the records there. So Acts chapter 9, we get this story of a guy named Saul. Now, if you're not familiar with this story, good for you. They're good. Sometimes good comes out of not being familiar with Bible stories as an adult, right? Okay, so in this book called Acts, which is the Acts of the Apostles, and it kind of tells us the story of the beginning of the early church of Christianity from a certain perspective. There was a guy named Saul. He was a Jewish leader, and he was going around and he was persecuting Jewish people that were following this way of Jesus. It was called the Way. So very early on, a guy named Saul, and Saul's traveling around, and as a Jew, he has the authority from the Sanhedrin. He has authority from the Supreme Court of the Jews, right, to go around and imprison people who are inhibiting and who are going against national policy, right? That's what's happening. That's what the story is telling us, okay? I'm not sure that that's what's happening, but that's what the story says is happening. History and the Bible are two different things, okay? Now, here's the thing. He's going around, he's persecuting, and he's on his way to this place called Damascus. And so this story is often called the Damascus Road experience. Or if you've ever heard the phrase like, oh, you've had a Damascus Road experience, this is where that comes from in case you're not familiar. You're like, what is a Damascus Road experience? Well, it's an experience that changes you, okay? So in Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 9, we get the setup of the story. He's traveling, he's got papers, he's going to go arrest these people who are following. Now, you could say Christians, but what you have to understand is there is no such thing as Christianity, right? There's just Judaism. And there are just people who are Jews who are following the teachings of this Rabbi Jesus, okay? And those teachings are seen as somewhat insurrectionist and destabilizing of the nation, okay? So he's traveling, and the story tells us that there's this big blinding light, and he's knocked off of his horse. And he falls to the ground, and he hears this disembodied voice that says, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. So now we have a resurrection story. See, some of you thought, oh, I was going to deviate from what we said we were going to do 6 weeks ago and stick with resurrection stories of Jesus. But no, Saul is having an encounter, a vision, an experience of some sort. He actually gives his own experience, his own story of this in some of his letters. But he hears this disembodied voice that says, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. And he says, get up, and the voice says, get up and enter the city, and you'll be told what you're to do. And then it goes on, it says, for 3 days he was without sight, and he neither ate nor drank. He's in bad shape. So that's a rough Tuesday, right? I mean, here he is, like he thinks wholeheartedly that what he's doing is in the service of God. And we have to hold that truth. Like what he's doing it is very zealous, and he believes that this is the right thing that he's doing. Now, notice how long he was there without food or drink. How long? 3 days. And on the third day, something powerful happens to him. Some of you are getting this, right? Like, please don't read these things literally, right? I mean, it could have been 3 days, who knows? But do we recognize that something powerful happens in 3 days in the story? Okay. I mean, we started this journey on Easter, which is like a third day moment, okay? Just want everybody with me, all right? So we'll pick up the story. Acts chapter 9, verses 10 through 18. Here's what happens. 3 days, he hasn't drinking. Drinking? He hasn't drank. Can't see. Doesn't know what's going on. Acts chapter 9, verse 10 says this. Now there was a disciple in Damascus named Ananias. Now, again, this is a Jewish person, disciple following the way of Jesus. And the Lord, now in Acts, the Lord is going to be Jesus, right? So he has a vision. He has some sort of experience with the resurrected Jesus. And in this vision, the Lord, or Jesus, says to him, Ananias. And he says, here I am, Lord, right? He's like, here I am. I'm here. Now notice what we have here. We have Ananias who's living what? Open-hearted. Here I am. Here I am. Just like, I'm not going to lie to you. If I have a vision of Jesus, I'm going to question a lot of things in my life. I'm just going to. right? And I live in a post-enlightenment world, right? But here's the thing. I don't know if my first answer is, here am I, right? I'm probably more like Scrooge. It's a bit of bad porridge. I don't know, like I just don't think I'm going to trust it. But I love that he's open-hearted. He is ready and willing to be present to love, present for what love has, present to the idea of spiritual work. I think that's a beautiful part of the story. And it's an invitation to how do we live to those moments where we sense the work of the divine, where we sense the work of love, calling us into something, calling us towards something that is scary, calling us towards something that is hope-filled. Here I am. Text goes on. Jesus says to him, get up and go to the street called Straight. And at the house of Judas, look for a man of Tarsus named Saul. At this moment, he is praying. This is what Jesus is saying. And he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias, that's you, come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight. It just gets weirder and weirder, right? Like these resurrection stories are not commonplace, okay? So Ananias hears Jesus. Now, Ananias says what I think a lot of us would. Lord, this guy's on my radar. A lot of us have heard about him, how much evil he's done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priests to bind all who invoke your name, to arrest us. Like, that's what we know. Can we just, maybe you're not aware, Jesus. I know you've been gone for a little bit. Which I'd love to talk to you about that, just leaving us here, in this mess. But this guy is no joke, right? We all know about him. Like, we're avoiding him, and you want me to, hold on a second. And, what do we see here? We see that fear kind of makes an appearance in the story. And Ananias reveals that while his heart is open, there's also a guardedness to it. Notice that he isn't like, I'm in, Jesus, absolutely. Now, mind you, remember in the story, this is a resurrected, crucified Jesus appearing to him who has flown away in a cloud. And he's still like, I don't know. I don't know about you, but that's not been my experience with the resurrected Jesus. And he is still skeptical of him, right? I love that. I mean, that absolutely gives me hope that I can actually walk this path. So he's having this vision, talking to Jesus, the whole thing. And he's like, yeah, maybe you haven't got your email this morning. Check your inbox. So he's holding this open heart, I'm in, I'm here, I'm present, but I'm gonna need a bit more information. I just need to know. And what I think we learn here is that the opposite of discernment, right? The opposite of discernment isn't just complete openness. That's not the opposite of discernment. The opposite of discernment, what will kind of fight against it is fear. Now, fear has its place, right? Fear has its place in our lives. Not all fear is bad. There's a great book I often will reflect on it called The Gift of Fear. But fear can easily move from a healthy thing that causes us a little pause, clarifying question, Jesus. Same Saul? Can we just talk about this, right? The problem is when fear starts to steer the ship. When fear starts to be the mechanism with which we make all of our decisions. And when that happens, fear becomes the one in charge. And fear will close the imagination. Fear will lock people into categories. Fear will assume that people can't change. Fear elevates this idea of protection to the highest value, as opposed to a value that's important. But fear will take self-protection and put it above everything else. And here's the thing. Fear had every reason to rule Ananias in this story. Saul was, in fact, dangerous. Ananias did not know about Saul's encounter. In the story here, we don't have this resurrected Jesus going, you're right, I forgot the lead. I already met with him. It's all good. It's all good. He's scared. He peed himself a little, I know. He didn't tell anybody, but I know he did. Wouldn't that be great if Jesus actually said that? Ananias, like, the guy peed himself. He was so scared. It was amazing. No. Those are the statements that got me fired. It wasn't the big things, no. But here's the thing. Resurrection wisdom that we see in Ananias, it interrupts that fear-based certainty. Right? There's something about this resurrection encounter with Ananias that, yes, he's got these concerns and there's this fear, but he's not certain about everything. See, fear wants guarantees before connection. Fear wants that certainty, but resurrection invites courageous presence in the midst of the uncertainty. See, fear says people never change, but the resurrection says, leave room for grace. Leave room for grace to work its power. And in a world full of polarization, in a world full of church hurt, in a tradition full of deconstruction, full of fractured families because of ideologies, full of social media outrage cycles, full of fear-based narratives, we need people who can balance this idea of wisdom and love and open-heartedness. See, in that world that's filled with all of these things, so many people are not actually practicing resurrection discernment. They're practicing self-protection, baptized as wisdom without love. Even within the church. Like, oh man, I'm going to make you all mad at me, and you're the good ones. Here's what this can look like. I just wish they would die. Powerful people in this world who are promoting policies and doing things, I just wish they would die. That's not Christ-like. I'm not saying I haven't had the thought. But see, that's fear baptized in wisdom without love. And the reason why I say this is because I know I've been changed. And I think the peacemaking path calls us to, rather than desire the death or the harm of someone, to desire their transformation, to desire their Damascus Road experience. And that's challenging and that's hard. And here's another sidebar for you. Some of us in this world, we have experienced manipulation, we have experienced abuse, you've experienced an unsafe religious environment that talks about this kind of stuff. And I want to explicitly say right now, open-heartedness is not boundarylessness. The challenge today of being open-hearted, of living with a guarded heart, is not to say that you live without boundaries. Discernment, resurrection discernment still matters. Wisdom still protects. Open-hearted living does not mean that you are abandoning boundaries or tolerating harm. Okay? That's not what I'm saying. So I want to be very clear. But there's a difference between holding a boundary, not tolerating harm, and crossing into a line where I baptize my self-protection, I baptize fear with this idea of wisdom that lacks love, that longs for the death of people. And I think when we do that, we actually aren't offering an alternative vision to the world. We're not offering a uniquely Christian vision. And then the question becomes, well, why exist? The much harder thing is to desire transformation, is to desire change. So the story goes on, and Ananias, he's like, hey, what's going on? It says, but Jesus says to him, go, just go. For he is an instrument whom I have chosen to bring my name before Gentiles and kings and before the people of Israel. Now remember, Acts is written well after Paul's death, right? So this is helping the people understand Saul's life, what was happening. And he says, I myself, Jesus says, I will show him how much he's going to suffer for the sake of my name. And so what happens? Ananias went and he entered the house. And he laid his hands on Saul, the text says, and look what he says. He says, "Brother Saul." We got to wait there for just a second. Brother Saul. I mean, don't rush past this. These are two little words, Brother Saul. And in those two words, we find what resurrection means, what faith means, what hope means, what love means. We find wisdom, trust, resurrection discernment. Because Ananias shows up in that moment. And this is a person who has been seeking his harm, actively harming people, putting people in prison. And he doesn't come in with Saul. He doesn't come in, I have to do this. No, like he shows up and he brings what we see as resurrection discernment, an encounter with the resurrected Jesus that shapes how he shows up in the world, and he comes with wisdom and love. Wisdom with love. Ananias enters the home. He's got a discerning spirit. He understands his own fears, he understands his faith, and he moves towards hope with trust in the power of divine love. After all that he had experienced, that Ananias had experienced, after all, he had been transformed, he had seen the light, he had moved towards this way of following Jesus. The question is, why not Saul? And so before Saul proves himself, brother. Before trust is established, brother. Before certainty exists, brother. Before the future is clear, brother. That's resurrection vision. That's hope. And it's on display right here in Ananias. And Ananias refuses, because he has encountered the resurrected Jesus, he refuses to reduce Saul at the time, to his worst moments. What are you saying, Ryan? I'm saying that Christianity without this is powerless, is nothing more than liberal progressive ideology. Name the political figure that you are most frustrated with right now in your head. Saul was violent. Saul was feared. Saul was harmful. Saul was dangerous. Saul was all those things of that political person in your head that you're thinking about right now that you can't stand. And Ananias shows up and says, "Brother Saul." That's the resurrection. That's the challenge. That's the difficulty. That's what needs to be empowered and fueled by the Spirit of God. That's love of enemy. Brother Saul. Ananias doesn't greet him as an enemy, doesn't greet him as a threat, doesn't greet him as a monster, an outsider. He says, brother. Not because the past doesn't matter, but because the past is only part of the story when we live open-hearted, when we are discerning, when we recognize that our lives are to be full of wisdom with love. Because fear teaches us people are the worst things they have ever done, but the resurrection asks us, what if grace still has more to say? What if grace really is that powerful? And what does he do? He comes over to Saul, who can't see, he's blind. He says, "Brother Saul." He lays his hands on him. He says, "Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on your way, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit." And immediately the text says something like scales fell from his eyes and his sight was restored. And then he got up and was baptized, and after taking some food, he regained his strength. And he was transformed. Now, there's a whole lot of stuff in this story that is meant to help us understand how transformation takes place. This story is not a call to unwise behavior. is not a call to a lack of discernment, but it's a call to recognize that what truly transforms people is grace and love. And when a person has gone through an experience in their life that positions them in soil ready for change, what they don't need is, but here's all the things you've done wrong. When the stars have aligned, when the universe has spoken, when we find ourselves in the space of brokenness and regret, that's where grace has its most power. There's so many things that led to this being a wise thing for Ananias to do, to be a space that was safe for him. But there was this belief, this trust, that grace can change. Grace can work and do powerful things. And so that open-heartedness of Ananias shows us that open hearts open doors of possibility. The possibilities for transformation in people's lives and in our world and in our community and in our families and in our relationships with siblings and our relationships with parents, an open heart opens a door of possibility. Imagine if Ananias had refused. No welcome, no healing, no scales falling off, no restored sight, no brotherhood, no Paul as we would know him, which is a complex history. I get it, the way Paul's been used. Some of you are like, it might have been better. I get it. But there's some beautiful things that we wouldn't have without Paul, who was the historical Paul, who was very radical. See, the future opens because someone stayed open-hearted without losing wisdom. And this is a deeply hopeful thought, that relationships can heal, people can change, trust can regrow, new futures can emerge. But closed hearts preserve present pain in the face of possibility, whereas open hearts create possibilities for future healing. And here's the thing. Every resurrection story begins with someone making room for a future they cannot yet fully see. Ananias had no idea what was going to happen, no idea what the future is, none of that, but he just had that resurrection vision, trusted it. And that's how resurrection stories work in our lives, in our world, is somebody just saying, I don't have the whole picture, but I'm going to live open-hearted to the possibility. So here's the promise we make to ourselves. Here's the promise. I promise me that I will live open-hearted without losing my wisdom. Do not be foolish with an open heart. That's not what this is about. It's saying I will live open-hearted, but I won't lose my wisdom when I do it. I will hold wisdom, and that is resurrection discernment. This is a promise to ourselves to be a discerning person who holds to wisdom with love, open to the possibility of the power of grace and love to transform the hardest of hearts. So fear, inside of this promise, fear won't guide me. Fear won't be the guide. Discernment, love with wisdom will keep my heart open to what feels impossible. And so in your everyday normal life, here's some ways to do this. These are just ideas, right? Number one, share a table with someone different. Share a table with someone different. The resurrection happened around tables and on roads, and it happened in ordinary conversations, and maybe healing still does. Maybe polarization is overcome not through legislation and not through these big grand gestures, but just by simple table gatherings, inviting someone to coffee, to lunch, to a walk, someone from a different generation, a different political perspective, a different spiritual background, someone who has a different identity than yours, a different life experience. And it's not to debate. Don't come with that. It's not to convince someone, but just to listen and learn. And in that moment, here's the second thing we can do. We can learn from a voice that stretches us. You know, that's really the only time you learn. How many of you all know if you signed up for a class and that teacher stood up there and didn't offer you anything that stretched you, you would learn nothing. You'd be super comfortable and you'd love to get the A, but you wouldn't learn anything. I mean, this is the crazy thing, right, about growth, is you can't grow without being uncomfortable. It's impossible. How many of y'all like that feeling of not knowing anything that's happening around you? right? Not a big fan of that. We don't love it. It's destabilizing, but you can't grow without it. It's the craziest thing. Sometimes this is one thing I would always say to my kids when they were in school, they were younger, they were little, they get frustrated, they wouldn't know. I said, the goal is not to know, the goal is to learn. And we think the goal of school is to know. Absolutely not. The goal is to learn. I remember I had an independent study in my program this past year, and I wrote a paper for it, and I said, here's what I know to my professor. I said to her, here's what I know. I have no idea if this is a good paper or not. No clue. Probably not. That would be my guess. But I know I could have never written it 8 weeks ago. And that's a win for me. Could have never done it, right? So we learn, that's growth, but it requires uncomfortableness because that's where we learn like our blind spots. When we hear those voices that bring us to a space that are different than ours. Sometimes we discover these blind spots like assumptions we didn't know we carried. Experiences we never had to think about. Pain we never noticed because it didn't affect us. That's called privilege. We all have it in some way in our lives. And so it's not guilt, but awareness. And this powerful act of learning from voices that are different, like it humanizes people that we tend to simplify or that we tend to erase in our assumptions. And many of us were taught that categories were important instead of people, instead of relationships. So we thought the category of liberal, conservative, religious, non-religious, queer, straight, immigrant, native born, young, old, deconstructing, traditional. We were taught these categories matter. But here's what's beautiful. The good news of Jesus, the gospel itself, erases harmful and destructive categories. And you know what we get from this guy named Saul who became Paul, who has been used to promote all kinds of harm in the world, but what we get from the radical, historical Paul who wrote in Galatians, in Christ Jesus, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female. Those are not, okay. What that text is telling us is that our categories are bull. That's what the text is saying. Those were the categories of the day. To get lost in the detail of the categories of the day and not carry the spirit of what Paul is saying to the categories of today or tomorrow is to miss the point of a living faith. So all those categories that we have, the gospel says, no, those categories are harmful. Categorization is harmful and destructive. And in the gospel, we learn to see people as interconnected, intersubjective with one another, being formed. And so listening changes those abstractions back into people. And that's resurrection-shaped work, because resurrection is always restoring personhood. Saul was an idea to Ananias, not a person, until he encountered Saul. And then finally, I want to encourage us to slow down before we react. Slow down before we react. Little principle, the three breaths and 3 questions rule. In that moment, before you respond in a difficult conversation, take 3 slow breaths. Relax your body. And ask these questions internally. What might I not understand yet? What about this person do I not quite get? What about this situation is not fully revealed? Second question, what is this person feeling? What are they feeling in the moment? Like, what's driving that? What emotion is driving that? And then here's a great question. What would wisdom and love both look like right now? I used to think that the greatest question we could bring to any situation is, what does love ask of me? I'm reframing that. I think the greatest question is, what does wisdom with love ask of me in this moment? Because that's living open-hearted with a sense of guardedness. And if we start living life with this idea of, I want to be open to what grace can do because grace changed me, grace challenges me, because I participated in systems of harm and there were people who loved me enough to just be present in the midst of it, to not dismiss me. Some powerful things happen in us and in our world. Wisdom grows. Wisdom in our lives grows whenever our world becomes larger than our own experience. when we can learn about the experiences of people we other, wisdom grows. Wisdom with love produces emotional maturity. Right? Wisdom with love will teach us how to stay calm, how to stay curious, how to tolerate ambiguity, how to resist becoming defensive, how to listen without immediately preparing our rebuttal. And that's spiritual formation. That's what's forming the little voice inside of our head to sound like the little voice that was inside Jesus' head. And so discernment, wisdom with love, resurrection discernment is not just learning what to reject. It's learning to remain grounded in a moment when listening is hard. And here's what's, I think, really powerful. Wisdom with love creates communities of healing. It creates people who heal, and when those people gather, we create a community that heals. Anybody ever heard the name Bell Hooks? You ever heard of Bell Hooks? Bell Hooks is a critical theorist. You've heard of Bell Hooks. She's a groundbreaking author, kind of a cultural critic, public intellectual. Her work really explored the intersection of love and race and gender and justice and education and healing all at once. And she was very accessible, but very, very prophetic in her writing. And she challenged these big systems of domination while at the same time calling people toward living lives that were rooted in compassion and community and truth-telling and transformative love. And this is what she said: rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion. Communion. Communion is a community that gathers around a central idea. We share in communion here every week because we gather not around progressive, liberal, conservative ideologies. We gather around this crazy belief that radical love, as displayed in the death and resurrection and life and teaching, these stories of Jesus, can transform us and our world to a place where all things flourish. And that's a different way of being in the world. And our desire, my desire for our community is that we are that space. We are that space of wisdom with love. We are that space where healing takes place, where people can come and find grace, that they'll never be defined by the worst thing they've ever done or the worst thing that they ever believed. And we can move forward together as a community that offers healing and grace and love. Our song, as we share in communion today, says, all belong here. All belong here. That's challenging if you really want to live it out. All belong here. And at some time and some place, when you create a community that's grounded in radical inclusion, there is an attitude, there is a heart condition that shows up that is exclusionary. And there's something that says that person is still welcome here because this is a space of healing that can transform whatever pain is causing the exclusion, whatever pain is causing the fear, that love wins. And that's what these elements call us to, even in the face of death. So I want to invite you to the table this morning. If you're sitting at a table, the elements are there. If you're on the sides or if you're in the bleachers, there's tables around. All are welcome. These symbols represent the ultimate sacrifice that any of us could ever give, is to lay down our lives for someone as a display of love and forgiveness and grace and hope and truth. And so we gather around these and we take them and we eat them and we ask that it be a moment that nourishes our soul towards this life of peacemaking. And so you're invited to the table today, no matter whether this is your first time, your last time, regardless of what you believe about Jesus, regardless of what you believe about politics or anything. This is a universal expression that we believe that a life grounded in love and forgiveness is what heals the world, even the people who we think of as Saul. And resurrection means even the Sauls in our lives are not beyond the repair of God's grace and not beyond the healing of a community. And that ought to shape our positionality towards our enemies. That ought to shape our positionality towards those who dehumanize. Otherwise, we just become what we loathe. And that's what the invitation is, that all belong here. So if you're here today and you're not sure if you belong here, you'd say, I participated in things that were harmful. If you knew the things that have been a part of my life, this table, this moment says you belong, because we are swimming in love. We are swimming in grace. You can't avoid it, but there's power in recognizing it. So the body of Christ broken for you, the blood of Christ shed for you, all belong here.